time ago, I had to take a job as a night attendant at an old county morgue in a quiet Pennsylvania town. In itself, it was an easy job, a 24-hour shift followed by 3 days of rest. Plus, as people in our profession like to joke, the clientele here was exceptionally cooperative. At first, of course, I was terrified as hell and disgusted to be around the dead bodies in the basement. But after a couple of weeks, the human psyche adapts and I got completely used to the constant sterile cold and the heavy stench of formaldehyde. On one cold autumn day, I clocked in for my regular shift. Toward the evening, old Mitch showed up in the office. This man had worked in this specific morgue for probably over 20 years, knowing every dark corner. He walked up to my desk, looked me straight in the eyes, and said in the very quiet voice, "Son, tonight, lock yourself inside in the night office with a deadbolt. And no matter what you hear, no matter what happens outside, do not dare to open that door. Tonight is the very bad night. All sorts of things can come here." Hearing this, I couldn't hold back. My intellectual arrogance took over and I literally snapped. I hit old Mitch with every rude epithet and mockery I could think of. It felt deeply insulting to me that an uneducated night watchman was trying to scare me, a man with a prestigious university degree, with some stupid children's ghost stories. Mitch listened to my tirade silently, his expression unchanged. He just signed and said quietly, "As you wish, I warned you." Then he turned around and walked away into the darkness of the corridor. By the end of the day, I probably wouldn't have even remembered this ridiculous incident, but one detail subconsciously alarmed me. Mitch was completely sober and his face was frighteningly serious. Usually he loved to drink and joked constantly, but not this time. Late in the evening, Dr. Andrews, our senior pathologist, stayed late at the morgue to talk with me about complex philosophical topics. We sat in the small night office, drinking strong coffee and arguing about life after death. But that detail, the sober, somber Mitch, just wouldn't leave my head, causing a strange sense of discomfort. Finally, closer to midnight, my companion said goodbye and left. I locked the heavy external entrance door of the building behind him and was left entirely alone in the whole complex. I did my mandatory rounds. I checked the cooling units, made sure everything was in order in the autopsy rooms, turned off the main lights, and returned to my night office. Our morgue had the following layout. Right past the entrance door was my office, and from it stretched a long T-shaped corridor. At the very end of this hallway were the heavy metal doors leading to the main cold storage and the dissection rooms. Throughout the night, only a few dim emergency lamps burned in that T-shaped corridor. In the night office itself, the light was also supposed to be on according to the rules, but I turned it off to catch some sleep. All the internal doors in the morgue were never locked with a key. They were just tightly closed. On my office door, there was an old iron latch, but we always left this door wide open. It was exactly the same on that ominous night. It was unnaturally quiet. Not a breath of wind outside, no noise from passing cars. I sat at the desk, lazily reading an old book, but every now and then I involuntarily listened to the creepy silence. Around midnight, I started to feel very drowsy, and I decided to lie down on the leather couch. And at that exact second, I clearly heard the heavy door of the cold storage room creak at the very end of the corridor. Carefully, almost silently, but it opened. I slowly peeked out of the night office into the hallway. The space was flooded with the dim, scattered light of the lamps. Where the morgue doors were, it was solid darkness, and it was impossible to make out anything. I felt extremely uneasy. Trying to calm my frayed nerves, I thought it was just a draft from the ventilation system. I decided to go and check why the door had opened. To give myself confidence, I stepped deliberately hard, and my footsteps echoed in the hollow, heavy rhythm of the tiled floor. And then I noticed, no, rather felt with my sixth sense, ahead, in the depth of the black corridor, some barely perceptible wet movement. Mitch's words instantly flashed in my brain. Lock yourself in and don't come out no matter what happens. A freezing sweat broke out over me. I began slowly, step by step, back into the night office. I burst inside, slammed the door with a wild force, and sharply flipped the iron latch. In that exact moment, the rustle of fast, heavy barefoot steps rushed down the T-shaped corridor. They stopped right outside my door. For a moment, silence reigned, and then, from the outside, someone forcefully, violently yanked the metal door handle. The door gave way by a few millimeters, but the old latch wouldn't let it go any further. In the narrow gap, an indistinct, massive dark silhouette flickered, and a sickeningly sweet smell of decomposition instantly leaked into the night office. I screamed in terror, squeezed my eyes shut, and with wild strength gripped the door handle with both hands from my side. From the corridor, something horrific and maddening was persistently trying to break inside to get to me. It stretched the wooden door furiously, jerked the handle up and down, and chaotically fumbled with long fingers along the frames and walls. And all this madness happened in complete, dead silence. Not a single gasp nor heavy human breathing could be heard from behind the door. Only the suffocating smell of death and old formaldehyde poured from the gap. Together with the first rays of dawn, a dead silence finally fell over the corridor. No one was stretching the walls anymore. No one was forcing their way into my night office. But for a very long time, I physically could not open my hands and let go of the door handle. I just stood there, pressed against the wood, clutching the metal with my fingers, which had turned white from the wild tension. A persistent, loud ring of the intercom buzzed me back to reality and forced me to open the latch. The corridor looked completely normal and was empty. Because of this, for a second, it seemed to me that everything that happened at night was just a wild nightmare dream of an exhausted mind. The iron lock, as always, jammed badly, and it took me a long time to open it with my trembling hands. Finally, I succeeded. My relief shift worker was standing on a porch. "Man, you're a heavy sleeper, buddy. I've been ringing for an hour," he exclaimed, stepping inside. I instantly mumbled something about secretly drinking too much medical alcohol during the night, not hearing anything, and that basically it was best not to bother me today. The day was already in full swing, but I still couldn't bring myself to go home. I nervously smoked one cigarette after another on the porch of the staff entrance, desperately trying to convince myself that the nightly horror was just a hallucination. Dr. Andrews was standing next to me. He was cheerfully asking me about something. I answered him mechanically, while in my head only one obsessive thought was pounding. It was a dream. This simply cannot be real. Just then, a pale young intern quickly stepped out onto the porch. He was breathing heavily. "Dr. Andrews, we have a very strange, inexplicable case here," he said excitedly. "I was just preparing the corpse of that drowned man on the autopsy table, the one the police brought in from the river 2 days ago. Well, his fingernails are packed full of old white paint. And what's so strange about that?" Dr. Andrews exhaled lazily, ash flipping from his cigarette. "The guy could have been painting a fence or a boat before he fell into the water. Yes, sir, the paint is indeed dried and old. The intern swallowed, his voice trembling. But the thing is, all those deep cracks and tears on the corpse's fingernails, they are fresh and they are absolutely post-mortem. He was clawing at something with his hands well after his heart had stopped beating. They walked back into the autopsy room, arguing loudly, while I slowly dropped my cigarette and walked down the T-shaped corridor toward the door of my night office. I stepped closer. At a human's chest height, on the perfectly smooth, white-painted wooden surface of my door, fresh, deep semicircular scratches and jagged torn gouges from human fingernails stood out clearly. Two girls, Julia and Roxy, went to a college party. At the party, Julia got pretty drunk, while Roxy was relatively sober. As is often the case, the sober one had to walk her fun friend home through the night city. Opening the door to Julia's dark apartment, Roxy somehow managed to put her friend into bed. Wishing her a good night, she turned off the light, closed the front door behind her, and walked back to her own home. After walking through a couple of dark alleys, Roxy suddenly realized that she had left her purse at Julia's house, which contained the keys to her own apartment. Coming back to Julia's, she opened the door with a spare key and decided not to turn on the hallway light so as not to wake her sleeping friend. Feeling around in the dark for her purse, which was lying on the armchair in the living room, she quietly left the apartment. The next day, Roxy got a call from the police asking her to come to the precinct immediately. In the interrogation room, they showed her a couple of the photos. Roxy realized in horror that it was Julia in the pictures. She was lying on her blood-soaked bed with a slit rod. The precinct detective showed Roxy a piece of paper that had been lying on the murdered Julia's bed. Written on it in crooked letters was, "Good thing you didn't turn on the lights. Otherwise, I would have had to kill you too." This happened a couple of years ago. At the time, I was living with my parents in a sprawling, old 3-bedroom apartment in a historic building. I always loved animals, but for some reason, they never lasted long in our house. They either died or ran away for unexplained reasons. There were many times when a pet would get severely sick, and in a miserable state we would give it away to a different home. And literally a week later, in a new house, animal would miraculously revive, become completely healthy, and live for many years. At first, I blamed it all on my own irresponsibility and inability to care for them. But one day, when I got a dog, I looked at it from a completely different perspective. My dog was constantly staring at something. It would sit in the middle of the room and stare into empty corners as if it saw something we didn't see. Sometimes it would bark aggressively at empty doorways and growl, baring its teeth. I tried to logically explain it to myself by thinking that it probably just heard the noise of the neighbors behind the old walls. But one night, I was lying in my bed. The apartment was submerged in silence. Suddenly, I heard the thick power cables from my laptop scattered across the floor start moving loudly. It sounded exactly like someone heavy had caught their feet in them and was dragging them across the hardwood floor. I thought it was my dad getting up for water. I called out to him into the dark, but nobody answered me. Then I called for my mom. Nothing. My only answer was the sound of someone's breathing coming from right out in the hallway. Deep, raspy breathing that did not sound human whatsoever. Shivers ran down my spine. I yelled, "Hey, stop messing around," hoping it was just a prank. No answer followed. I forced myself to get up and walked out into the dark hallway to see who was there. There was no one. I carefully peeked into my parents' room. They were fast asleep. At that exact moment, my dog started owling in the living room. It was a long, pitiful owl full of pure fear. And that is when I started to feel truly terrified. A couple of weeks later, the situation escalated. My parents went away for the weekend, and I was left to sleep at home absolutely alone. I watched a movie, turned off the lights everywhere, and went to bed. Barely had I settled under the blanket when a sound echoed. Someone knocked clearly 3 times on the wooden door of the bathroom. Probably any person knows exactly how a knock sounds on every specific door in their own house. I froze. I stopped breathing. A dead, oppressive silence fell over the apartment. I started calming myself down, thinking I just imagined it, but then came 3 more loud, slow knocks, this time on the front door. I jumped out of bed. I was shaking. I grabbed my phone and immediately called my older brother, Mark, who lived just a 10-minute walk away from me. I started hysterically explaining to him that someone was inside the apartment. He told me not to panic and to calm down. He advised me to walk up to the door and look through the peephole. I did exactly that. I walked down the long hallway toward the front door, turning off the lights in every single room along the way to feel safe. But the second I reached the front door, the lights in the entire apartment violently shut off. The power was cut. I was completely paralyzed by shock in the darkness. I pressed my face against the door and looked through the peephole. I could clearly see that the lights in the hallway outside were still on. The problem was only inside my apartment. I started crying into the phone from fear and begged Mark to come to me. He said, "I'm leaving right now. Lock yourself in the..." But he couldn't even finish his last sentence before my phone simply shut off. The screen went black. The battery couldn't possibly be dead because it had been on the charger all day. I was left in suffocating darkness. I gathered my courage and with a determined but trembling step walked to the pantry for candles. I lit a candle, took it in my hand, and walked back to my room, whispering prayers for all of this to stop. And then I heard footsteps inside the apartment, right in the hallway. At first, they were slow, heavy steps, and then someone bolted and literally ran into my room. The sound of the footsteps stopped right in front of me in the gloom. From that visceral fear, I started having severe gag reflexes. I rushed into the bathroom and I literally threw up from the sheer stress. And then I heard a sharp ring from the intercom. I was incredibly surprised because I knew that if there was no power in the apartment, the intercom shouldn't be working either. I ran out into the hallway. Barely had I reached the door when suddenly a loud knock echoed again. I froze, expecting the worst, but then I instantly heard Mark's voice behind the door. Sighing with massive relief, I clicked the lock and threw the door open. At that exact moment, like a snap of the finger, the lights turned back on the entire apartment. And immediately, I heard the chime of my phone turning itself back on in my bedroom. Mark stood on the threshold. He had also seen the lights suddenly turn on by themselves, and now he was looking at my face, which was as pale as a chalk. We sat in the kitchen that entire night without closing our eyes. After that incident, the entity stopped hiding. Everyone in the household began to constantly hear someone heavy walking around the apartment. Dishes would shatter on their own, Wires would fly through the air. Relationships in the family became incredibly tense. We were always fighting because of that oppressive feeling. Soon, we made the decision to move out immediately. We sold the apartment. New tenants moved in. Literally a month later, these new tenants called up early in the morning. They tearfully asked if we had ever noticed anything unusual in that apartment. We shuddered and answered negatively, hiding the truth. Then, with a trembling voice, they told us what happened. During the night, they heard the horrific scream and crying of their infant daughter. They ran into the nursery in the panic, and what they saw made them freeze in absolute horror. Their baby wasn't lying in the crib. The baby was suspended in the air 3 feet off the floor. The little girl was choking as if someone large and invisible was tightly holding her by the throat. As soon as the adults entered the room and screamed, the invisible hand sharply released its grip. The infant fell to the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The little girl suffered a concussion that night. What that creature was and how those people are living now, I don't know. I hung up the phone and never contacted them again. But every single day, I thank God that we moved out of that cursed apartment in time. I was born in 1980 and grew up in a small, dying steel town in Ohio, right in the heart of the Rust Belt. It was a very special, unique time. Everything felt somehow easy and uncomplicated. Everyone knew each other, and the exact same families lived in the exact same houses for decades. I still visit my hometown once a year, and it feels like absolutely nothing has changed there. The same old neighbors, the same cashiers in the local stores that survived. But what I remember most from my childhood is my middle school years. Life in the early 90s was completely different. We didn't have smartphones, social media, or modern consoles. We spent our days outside, riding our bikes until the streetlights came on. It was a glorious, carefree time, but it was also when I had the most terrifying experience of my entire life. It was the first and hopefully the absolute last time I ever encountered the supernatural, and I still cannot forget it, even after all these years. I was in the 7th grade, making me about 12 years old. As always, my group of friends and I were hanging out late. It was around 10:30 at night. We were sitting in the dark alleyway, swapping urban legends and ghost stories. Teenage arrogance was in full swing, and my youthful maximalism made me want to prove that I wasn't afraid of anything. Not far from our neighborhood stood an old, partially condemned school building. It looked incredibly menacing in the dark. The dare was simple but terrifying. Break in through the front entrance, sneak past the night watchman, run up to the 3rd floor, open a specific window, and look out at the courtyard. It had to be done in pitch-black darkness, because I absolutely hated feeling weak or giving the other guys a reason to doubt my courage. I foolishly volunteered to do it. As soon as I agreed to the dare, I instantly felt my status rise among the guys. We had 7 people in our group. Riding that massive wave of adrenaline and superiority, I walked to the old school. Standing on the crumbling concrete porch, I peeked through the dirty glass. The night watchman was fall asleep at his desk, his heavy breathing audible even through the thick door. I carefully pulled the door open and slipped into the dusty lobby. I crawled on my stomach right past the guard, slipped behind the concrete pillar, and got to my feet. My friends were supposed to wait outside in the courtyard by the window. I was now on the 1st floor, in total, suffocating darkness without a flashlight. I blindly felt my way along the cold metal lockers to the stairwell. I moved agonizingly slowly. One wrong step and I could fall because it was so dark you couldn't see your own hand. It took me 10 minutes to creep up to the second floor and another 10 to reach the third. As soon as my foot hit the landing of the third floor, my heart stopped. I heard a voice echoing loudly from the very bottom of the stairwell. It was one of my best friends yelling frantically, "Run away, quick! Run back down!" Deep anxiety hit my chest. But just as I turned around to head back down, I heard another shout coming from the courtyard, right outside the open window. It was the exact same friend who had just called me from the stairs. He screamed, "Don't go anywhere! Stand perfectly still and don't move!" I wasn't just scared anymore. I was absolutely paralyzed with a visceral dread. Then, from the dark stairwell below me, the first voice yelled again, "Hurry up and run down! I'm right here! Don't listen to anyone!" I froze, completely immobilized, hot tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what to do, who to believe, or where to run. The voice from the stairwell screamed again, but now it sounded like a bizarre chorus of several guys from my group speaking at once. "There is nobody in the courtyard. We're all standing down here. Do not go to the window. We're coming up." Suddenly, an unnatural, guttural roar echoed through the entire building, and the voices from the stairs shouted in perfect unison, "Run!" I screamed hysterically and blindly sprinted down the dark hallway, completely ignoring the window. Heavy thudding inhuman footsteps were rushing up the stairs right behind me. "Don't go to the window! Don't go forward!" The mimicking voices from the stairs shrieked. At the exact same time, a voice from the open window roared, "Jump!" I hit a dead end in the hallway. The things from the downstairs were rushing up, and I was crying and screaming, trapped in the nightmare. Suddenly, my frantically searching hand brushed against a cold metal doorknob at the very end of the corridor. I yanked the heavy door open, slipped inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I found myself in a cramped utility closet. There was a metal ladder attached to the wall leading up to the roof hatch. Without a single second of hesitation, I scrambled up the rungs, pushed the heavy iron hatch open, and crawled out onto the flat, gravel-covered roof. My heart almost stopped beating entirely. Sitting right there on the roof, huddled together, was my entire group of friends. I screamed in terror, "Don't come near me!" One of my friends rushed over, pushed me hard in the shoulder and hissed, "Are you a complete idiot? We climbed up here using the rusted fire escape. The very second we heard someone calling your name inside the school." I stared at him in absolute shock, my mind completely breaking down. "Wait," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Then who was standing by the window down there?" "We didn't even make it to the window," he replied, shaking like a leaf. "We were walking behind the school, and then we heard our own voices coming from the dark courtyard, and we got terrified." The voices inside the school had gone completely silent, but we were way too terrified to even peek over the edge of the roof. We sat up there shivering until 7 in the morning, until the bright sun came up and the normal people started walking on the streets below. We climbed down the fire escape and never spoke of that horrific story out loud again. But I will remember that terrifying night for the rest of my life. I forced my heavy eyes open and propped myself up on my elbows in the bed. The digital clock glowed with a crimson light in the dark, showing 3:23 a.m. Standing by my bed was my little daughter. "Do you want to crawl into bed with us and tell me about him?" I whispered, rubbing my eyes. "No, Daddy," she replied quietly. The strangeness of the situation made me wake up almost completely. The room was cold. I could barely make out the pale figure of my little girl in the darkness of the bedroom. "Why not, sweetie? It's just a bad dream," I said. "Because in my dream, when I told you about him, someone wearing mommy's skin woke up on the bed right next to you." For a moment, my heart dropped into my stomach. My breathing stopped. I froze, blood running cold with terror, unable to take my eyes off my daughter standing in the doorway. And then someone slowly rustled the blanket right behind my back. It is rumored that after midnight, the world changes. The boundaries between reality and something else become thin. This story happened a year ago. My best friend Leo and I were celebrating his 16th birthday. We spent the whole day in the city. Pizza, arcades, movie. Time flew by. We lived out in the suburbs, 100 miles away from the city, and we had to catch the last train home. We sprinted onto the platform of the central station at 5 minutes to midnight. The station was almost completely empty. Just the echo of our footsteps bouncing off the marble walls. The digital board glowed with our train, Route 113, departure at 12 a.m. The train was already waiting at the platform. It was an old, weathered commuter train. The doors hissed open and we stepped inside. We collapsed into the seats, our faces happy but exhausted. There were a couple of minutes left before departure and I looked around. The car looked normal, but something felt off. The fluorescent lighting was too bright, almost sterile, like a hospital. It had a low, monotonous humming sound. Right above the door, there was a metal plate with a stamped number, Car 113. Besides Leo and me, there were only 2 other people in the car. They were sitting near the very front, an elderly man in an old gray coat and a middle-aged woman sitting next to him. I noticed them because they were sitting unnaturally straight. They weren't reading newspapers or looking at their phones. They were just staring straight ahead at the empty wall. In all of the time we waited for departure, I didn't see them blink or shift their weight once. There was a strange coldness radiating from them, but I just brushed it off, blaming my own exhaustion. At exactly midnight, the doors slid shut. The train lurched forward and glided smoothly into the night. 10 minutes later, we left the city limits behind. The lights of the buildings vanished from the windows, replaced by the solid, impenetrable blackness of the woods. Occasionally, a lonely street lamp would zip past, casting long, dancing shadows through the cabin. At that moment, the harsh light in the car suddenly flickered and shifted into a soft, dim glow. The monotonous clacking of the wheels over the tracks was hypnotic. Leo had already closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold glass. I tried to fight off the sleep, but my eyelids felt like lead. The quiet hum of the train swallowed me whole, and I drifted off. I woke up to someone shaking my shoulder. Hey, wake up! Our stop is next." Leo's voice sounded muffled. I rubbed my eyes, feeling deeply disoriented. The train car was completely silent, too silent. The man and the woman at the front were sitting in the exact same positions. I looked down at my wristwatch and I was stunned. It was 2 a.m. "Already?" I asked, confused. The trip usually took an hour and a half, but 2 full hours had passed. The train started to slow down. We were pulling into the second to last station before our town. The train screeched to a halt at the platform. The doors slid open. Freezing damp air rushed into the cabin. The train always waited at the station for 5 minutes to let a freight train pass. "I'm gonna step out for a minute, get some fresh air," I told Leo. He just nodded, staring blankly at the floor. I stepped down onto the concrete platform. The station was blanketed in the thick, heavy fog. A few dim yellow lights barely pierced through the mist. It was absolutely desolate. No station master, no cars in a parking lot, just a dead silence that made my ears ring. I stood by the front door of the train car, taking deep breaths of the cold air, and then a strange detail caught my eye. On the opposite side of the tracks, standing in deep shadow, was a figure. It was a tall silhouette of the man, and he was doing something weird. He was slowly, almost unnaturally, waving his hand at me. Curiosity overpowered my fear. I took a few steps forward, squinting through the fog, trying to make out his face. The closer I got, the more my stomach tied itself into knots. Suddenly, the man stopped waving. He lowered his arm, and then he started to laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was a dry, grating sound, like metal scraping against metal. An eerie, maniacal laughter that echoed across the empty station. Then, he raised a hand with long, thin fingers and pointed right behind me, at the train. At first, I didn't understand what he meant, but the laughter grew louder, filling my head. In a state of panic, I spun around, and I froze in absolute shock. I almost fell to my knees. The train was gone. The massive, multi-ton metal train simply wasn't there. The tracks were completely empty. There was no sound of doors closing, no horn, no clacking of wheels. The train had vanished into the fog in absolute silence, as if it had evaporated into thin air. I spun back around. The silhouette of the laughing man was gone too. I was left completely alone in the freezing void. Panic consumed me. I sprinted toward the old terminal building, pounding on the locked doors, trying to find anyone. Finally, I found the night watchman in a security booth. I hysterically started asking him about Route 113, begging him to contact the dispatcher, screaming that my best friend was still on that train. The watchman looked at me like I was insane. The color drained from his face. What he told me next, I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Son," he said, his voice trembling, "Route 113 isn't running tonight. The tracks are closed." I didn't believe him. I kept yelling. Then he silently reached under his deck, pulled out yesterday's newspaper, and pressed it against the glass of the booth. The massive headline read, "Tragic derailment of Express Route 113. 2 days ago, that exact train had derailed at full speed, plunging off a bridge into a gorge." My eyes scanned the text. My breathing stopped. The article stated that there were no survivors. Among the officially identified fatalities were an elderly man, a middle-aged woman, and a 16-year-old boy named Leo. A year has passed, but I still wake up in a cold sweat. I am tormented by questions that have no answers. How did I even get to that station? If Leo died 2 days prior, who was I walking around the city with all day? And the most terrifying thought of all, who was sitting next to me in the train car? My best friend, or something else, something that took his shape to take me with it. And if I hadn't stepped out onto the platform for fresh air, where would the train have finally taken me?